All right, let's dive in. Today, we're tackling some serious brain food, huh?
You requested it. It's Descartes time.
Meditations on first philosophy, no better place to start, right?
Straight to the source. We even pulled some of his letters, too, for extra context.
Always good to hear him in his own words. So, René Descartes, 17th century philosopher, what's the big deal?
He was kind of obsessed with finding a solid foundation for knowledge.
Yeah, that whole what can we really know for sure question.
Exactly. He wanted to build a system of understanding, like from the ground up, based on absolute certainty.
Hmm.
And the thing is, our senses, well, they can be pretty misleading.
Oh, yeah, totally. Think about optical illusions or like how easy it is to misinterpret something you hear.
Exactly. So he started by doubting everything.
Wait, really? Everything? Like, hold on a second. That sounds kind of extreme, doesn't it?
It might sound like crazy skepticism, but there was a method to his philosophical madness.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What was he trying to achieve with all this doubt?
He was looking for something undeniable, something he could build on. Think of it like demolishing a rickety building to build something stronger in its place.
I like that. Strip it all down to the foundation, see what's really there.
Right. And to push this to the limit, he even imagines an evil genius who's trying to trick him about, like, everything.
Whoa, an evil genius. That's next level doubt.
It's a brilliant thought experiment. I mean, even today we worry about fake news simulations. It's like he was ahead of his time.
Totally. But even with this all-powerful deceiver, Descartes finds something he can't doubt.
Ah, yes. His famous line, "I think, therefore I am."
Okay, but help me out here. How does doubting everything prove that you exist?
Think about it. Even if everything you perceive is a lie, the very act of doubting, of thinking, means there must be a thinker.
So even if I'm being tricked about what's real, the fact that I'm thinking at all proves something's there me.
You got it. And that's the bedrock of certainty he was looking for, the foundation for everything else. And from there, he goes on to explore the relationship between the mind and the body, which, well, gets really interesting. Yeah, the mind-body problem. It's a classic for a reason. And Descartes really dives into it, like head first.
Okay, so how do we go from this, I think, therefore I am, to figuring out what our minds and bodies even are?
Well, Descartes starts with this really interesting thought experiment. Remember we were talking about how our senses can be kind of tricky?
Yeah, like we can't always trust what we see or hear or even feel, right?
Right. And he uses this example of, like, melting wax.
Melting wax, how does that work?
Okay, so picture a piece of wax. You can see its shape. You see the color, feel the texture. It's hard,
Oh,
right?
yeah, I'm picturing it.
Now bring it close to a flame. Watch what happens. It starts to melt.
Right, it becomes liquid, like changes completely.
The shape's different. The texture is totally different, right? Even the smell changes. But is it still wax?
Yeah, of course it's still wax. It's just, in a different form.
Exactly. So how do we know it's the same wax, even though all of those sensible properties have changed?
Well, I mean, it seems obvious, right? Like, it's still wax, even though it looks and feels different. But I guess, if you really think about it,
Right. Think about it. It's not just our senses giving us that knowledge. It's something more.
our minds are doing something, right? Like understanding what wax is, even if it looks totally different.
Exactly. Our minds can grasp the true essence of something beyond just what our senses pick up.
Okay, so he's starting to make a distinction between our senses and our minds.
Yeah, and that leads him to one of his most famous ideas, the mind-body distinction. He basically argues that the mind and the body are fundamentally different substances.
That was a pretty big deal back then, wasn't it? Like, a lot of people probably just assumed the mind and body were, like, the same thing.
He was radical. And this idea, it has all these implications, even today, right? Like, think about artificial intelligence or, like, the idea of uploading your consciousness.
Whoa, yeah. It's like he was grappling with the precursors to all these futuristic questions centuries ago. Okay, so mind and body, two different things. But wait, doesn't Descartes also, like, try to prove God's existence?
He does. And for him, it wasn't just, a leap of faith or something. It's all part of his carefully reasoned argument.
Okay, I have to admit that part always kind of throws me off. How do you go from doubting everything to suddenly proving God exists?
Well, he has two main points. First, he focuses on this idea of a perfect being, right? Like the idea of God.
Okay, yeah, God is supposed to be perfect, all-knowing, all that.
Right. And Descartes says we have this innate idea of a perfect God, but we, humans, well, we're imperfect.
Yeah, I think we can all agree on that.
So where did this idea of perfection come from? It couldn't have come from us, right? We're not perfect.
Yeah.
So he argues It had to be put there by something perfect.
Like something can't create something greater than itself.
Exactly. A child can't design a spaceship. It takes a more advanced mind. So he's saying, for us to even have the idea of a perfect being had to put it there.
I see. So that's the first part of his argument. And then what's the second part?
Well, that's his cause and effect argument. Since we have this idea of a perfect being, the cause of that idea must be at least as perfect.
Right, because you can't get more perfection from something that's less perfect. So again, it leads back to God.
Exactly. But now think about this. If God is perfect and he created us, then why do we mess up so much? Why do we make mistakes?
Yeah, that's always been a bit of a head scratcher, hasn't it? If we're made in God's image, shouldn't we be like perfect too?
Well, Descartes tackles that directly. It's called the problem of error. And he says, well, it comes from our free will.
Okay, free will. So we have the choice to do the right thing, but we also have the choice to mess up.
Exactly. God gave us this incredible ability to make judgments, even when we don't fully understand something. And sometimes we just jump to conclusions, right? We make hasty judgments, and that's where errors come in.
So it's not God's fault we make mistakes, it's us misusing our free will.
Yeah, it's like we have this awesome tool, but we got to learn to use it responsibly. Which brings us to the last big question. Can we trust our senses at all?
I gotta admit, after all this talk about evil geniuses and unreliable senses, I'm a little nervous to hear the answer.
Descartes doesn't want us to live in a constant state of doubt. He doesn't think we should throw out our senses completely. He actually believes God wouldn't have given us these senses just to mislead us all the time.
So there's gotta be a purpose to our senses, right? Like, what are they good for if they're not giving us a perfect picture of reality?
Well, he thinks our senses are primarily for survival.
Okay.
They tell us what's good for us and what's dangerous. Like, fire is hot, don't touch, or this food smells bad, don't eat it.
So it's like a basic warning system,
Yeah,
keeping us alive.
exactly. It's like a simplified version of reality.
Okay, so our senses are kind of like a user interface for navigating the world, giving us just enough information to function.
That's a great way to put it. And that's why Descartes says it's crucial to use our intellect along with our senses. Like, we got to analyze what we're sensing, not just blindly trust everything.
Be discerning. But how do we know if we're not just making stuff up or misinterpreting what our senses are telling us?
Well, he says we can be certain about some things, like mathematical truths, right? We can understand shapes, sizes, proportions.
Right, like those are kind of universal no matter what our senses are telling us.
Yeah. And he says God, being all-powerful and benevolent, well, he could definitely create a world that corresponds to those mathematical truths.
But does that mean those things definitely exist outside of our minds, like in the physical world? It still feels like we're stuck in our heads a bit.
You're right to point that out. And that's where Descartes brings in the idea of imagination.
Imagination. How does that help us figure out what's real?
He says it's like a bridge between our minds and the physical world.
Okay, a bridge between imagination and the physical world. I'm listening.
So he says imagination is different from pure intellect. When we use our intellect, we're just thinking abstractly, using logic. But with imagination, we're creating a mental picture.
Like, if I'm thinking about a triangle, that's intellect, but if I'm picturing a specific triangle in my mind, that's imagination.
Exactly. And Descartes says this act of imagining, it actually relies on a connection to our physical body. It's like our minds are turning outwards towards the body to perceive something beyond themselves.
So, the fact that we can even imagine things suggests that there's got to be something out there to imagine. It's like our imagination is bumping up against the real world.
That's the idea. It's not like a foolproof argument,
Uh-huh.
but it's another piece of the puzzle.
I can see how it adds to his overall theory, but what about all those other qualities we perceive? Like colors, sounds, smells. Those aren't just like math problems. How do we know those are real?
He admits those are tougher. He calls them secondary qualities, and they're way more subjective. They depend on our individual bodies and experiences.
Right, like what I think is a beautiful color, someone else might hate, right?
Exactly. And he even says he's caught himself making hasty judgments based on those sensations. Like thinking a star is smaller than a candle flame just because it looks that way from far away.
We totally do that, right? We project our own interpretations onto things.
All the time.
Yeah.
So he's urging us to be careful with those secondary qualities, not just assume they perfectly reflect reality.
So then how do we know what to believe? If we can't fully trust our senses, especially with those subjective qualities, it feels like we're doubting everything again.
He wouldn't want us to go back to that. Remember, he believed God wouldn't just give us senses that constantly lie to us.
Okay, so there's got to be a purpose, right? Even if our senses aren't perfect.
He says our senses are mainly designed to help us navigate the world, to stay alive. They tell us what's good for our bodies, what we should avoid, like we feel pain when we touch something hot so we don't get burned. That's pretty useful.
Yeah, like our senses are our built-in survival guide, basically.
Exactly. But they don't necessarily give us a perfectly accurate picture of reality itself, just the information we need to survive.
So it's about using our minds, right? Thinking critically about what we're sensing, not just accepting everything as fact.
You got it. He doesn't say throw out your senses. He says use them wisely, use your intellect too, and know that they have limits.
Okay, that makes sense. But then how do we explain when our senses like completely deceive us?
Hmm.
Hallucinations, mirages. If God designed our senses, why would he let them make those kinds of errors?
That's a great question. And Descartes, well, he doesn't shy away from it. He talks about how our bodies, even though created by God, can be prone to malfunctions.
Yeah.
Like think of a clock that's been built wrong.
Okay, so he's comparing the human body to a machine that can break down.
Yeah, like a complex machine. He even uses the example of a person with dropsy who's constantly thirsty, but drinking more water would actually hurt them.
So their body is sending the wrong signal. Like thirst usually means you need water, but in that case, it's harmful.
Exactly. It's a malfunction.
Yes.
And he says that can happen with other sensations too. Our senses aren't foolproof.
That's a little unsettling, but also kind of realistic. Our bodies aren't perfect. So then what's the solution? How do we avoid being tricked by these glitches?
He gives us a few strategies. He really stresses using multiple senses whenever we can. Like if we just rely on sight, it's easier to be tricked. But if we can touch, smell, hear something too, it gives us more information, right?
Like, check your sources, but for your senses.
Exactly. And he also says memory is important. Our past experiences help us interpret what we're sensing now.
It's like our memory is a database of past sensations that helps us make sense of the present.
Right. And of course, he's always emphasizing the intellect. We got to use our minds, think critically, not just passively absorb information.
It's like he's giving us this toolkit for critical thinking, right? Multiple senses, memory, knowing things can go wrong. That's pretty empowering, knowing that we have the ability to question what we're experiencing.
Exactly. Descartes saw the limits of human perception, but he was also optimistic about our ability to work with those limits,
Hmm?
through reason, through careful observation.
So it's not about giving up on trying to understand the world. It's about using our minds to the fullest, not being afraid to question what we see and hear.
Exactly. And to really get how we can use our minds effectively, well, we need to dive a bit deeper into that mind-body distinction.
Okay, let's get into that mind-body distinction a bit more. I'm still a little fuzzy on how it all works. It's one thing to say they're separate, but like we experience them together, right?
Yeah, it's definitely not a simple concept. Descartes knew that. He says they're distinct, yeah, but also super intertwined. He actually uses the word intermingled to describe it.
Intermingled. So like not just side by side, but really woven together somehow.
Yeah, more like that. It's not like he's saying our minds are off somewhere else, detached from our bodies.
Right. So how do they work together then?
He uses this analogy of a pilot in a ship. The pilot's separate from the ship, right?
Right.
But he's also guiding it, and he's affected by what happens to the ship.
Oh, I like that. So our minds are kind of steering our bodies, but our bodies are also giving us feedback, like through sensations and emotions and stuff.
Exactly. It's a two-way street. And that leads to some interesting ideas about how this connection can actually cause errors in how we perceive things.
Oh, yeah, we were talking about hallucinations and mirages earlier, right? Is that what he's getting at?
Yeah, partly. He points out that sometimes the signals our bodies send to our minds don't match up with what's really happening in the world.
Like that example with the dropsicle person. They feel thirsty, even though drinking would be bad for them. Their body's sending a totally wrong message.
Exactly. And it's not just thirst, it can happen with other senses too.
Yeah.
Our bodies can be tricky like that.
It makes you wonder how often we misinterpret stuff. Like, are we projecting things onto our experiences without even realizing it?
That's a key point, yeah.
Mm.
Our senses are meant to help us,
Mhm.
but they can also lead us astray sometimes. And the good thing is Descartes doesn't just leave it at that, pointing out the problem. He actually gives us ways to deal with it.
Okay, I'm all ears. What can we do to avoid those errors? To make sure we're not being fooled by our own bodies?
He says whenever we can, use multiple senses. Don't just rely on one. Like if we only use sight, it's easier to be tricked by illusions and stuff. But if we can also touch something or smell it or hear it, we get a better picture.
It's like fact-checking, but with our senses. Don't just trust one source. Get multiple perspectives.
That's a great way to put it. And he also talks about the importance of memory. Our past experiences, they help us make sense of what we're sensing now.
Yeah, it's like our memory is this giant library of sensory data, right? We
Yeah.
can use it to cross-reference what's happening in the present.
Exactly. And then, of course, he's always coming back to the power of intellect. Use your mind, think critically, don't just passively take in information.
So it's about being aware, right?
Okay.
Knowing our senses can trick us, being willing to question what we're experiencing. It's like Descartes is giving us this mental toolkit to navigate the world.
Exactly. He knew how limited our perception can be,
Hmm.
but he also believed in our ability to overcome those limitations, through reasoning, careful observation, thinking things through.
Wow, it's incredible how much we've covered. We've gone from doubting everything to proving God exists to exploring the mind and body, all using the power of our own minds.
It's a pretty wild ride. And while he provides answers, he also leaves us with a lot to think about.
I'm always up for a good philosophical challenge. What kind of questions did he leave us with?
He really believed in the power of reason to help us understand the world, but he also knew it's not easy. So here's something to ponder in our world today with so much information coming at us from all directions. How do we use reason to separate truth from falsehood? How do we know what to believe?
That is a big question, and something I think we all struggle with these days.
It's something to keep in mind, and I think that's the beauty of philosophy. It's not about having all the answers. It's about asking the right questions, being curious, embracing a little bit of doubt, and always trying to learn more. And Descartes' Meditations, well, they're a great example of that.
I feel like I've had a serious mental workout today, and I loved it. This deep dive into Descartes has really made me appreciate the power of critical thinking and how important it is to question everything, even our own senses.
It's been a pleasure exploring these ideas with you, and yeah, keep questioning, keep wondering, stay curious.
Until next time, everyone, keep those minds sharp, and remember, a little doubt can go a long way.